His parents' jet exploded in the sky, yet the 4-year-old Heir did not die. Lost in a hostile jungle, hunted by wolves, saved by a silverback, Jide survived a decade in the wild, while his billionaire uncles celebrated his death and seized his empire. Now they know he's alive, and they're coming back to finish what they started. Amadi Okiki was 33 years old, and already the only billionaire in his bloodline. His rise had been steady and calculated. What began as a technology logistics firm in his mid-20s expanded into energy, real estate, and aviation. Investors described him as disciplined. Competitors described him as relentless. Employees described him as fair. Within a decade, he had built a conglomerate that reshaped his family's status and placed the Okiki name among the most influential in the country. Physically, Amadi carried the presence of someone accustomed to responsibility. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a deep bronze complexion and a sharply defined jaw. His beard was always trimmed low and precise. He preferred tailored charcoal and navy suits, crisp white shirts, and understated wristwatches whose value was known only to those familiar with luxury craftsmanship. He spoke calmly, rarely raising his voice. His wealth did not make him flamboyant, it made him deliberate. He believed that success was incomplete if it was not shared. Amadi was the youngest of 5 brothers. Before his ascent, the family's circumstances had been modest. His 4 elder brothers had struggled through unstable businesses and inconsistent incomes. Some ventures failed quietly, others collapsed publicly. Debt and pride weighed heavily on them long before Amadi's success transformed their reality. When his companies began generating significant profit, Amadi did not distance himself from his family. Instead, he brought them in. He made each of his brothers official stakeholders in his primary companies. Legal documents were drafted, shares were allocated. Monthly dividends were structured and transferred without delaying. Beyond corporate inclusion, he purchased houses for them in high-end, gated estates. The properties were expansive, with manicured lawns and private security. Imported vehicles followed, luxury sedans and SUVs delivered with full registration and maintenance coverage. Within a few years, the 4 brothers were millionaires. From the outside, the gesture appeared noble. Media profiles described Amadi as family-oriented. Photographs captured the brothers standing beside him at corporate events, smiling beneath chandeliers and camera flashes. But generosity does not silence insecurity. Chuka, the eldest at 39, had always carried himself with quiet authority in the family. Heavy-set, with calculating eyes and a permanently furrowed brow, he spoke slowly and measured his words. His silence was rarely passive. It was observant. Before Amadi's rise, Chuka had considered himself the natural head of the family. That assumption dissolved the day financial dependence reversed their hierarchy. Emeka, 37, was slender and restless. His sharp cheekbones and expressive hands made him appear animated in conversation. He possessed charm and social agility, often acting as the public-facing representative at events. Yet beneath his polished exterior lived impatience. He disliked waiting. He disliked control he did not hold. Ike, 35, was muscular and direct. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, a remnant of a street altercation from his youth that he often recounted as proof of resilience. His temper was immediate. Where Chuka calculated and Emeka negotiated, Ike reacted. Kelechi, at 34, appeared the most composed. Soft-spoken and neatly dressed, he projected reason. His suits were immaculate,
his speech restrained. He often played mediator during disagreements, but beneath that calm surface lay a resentment he concealed carefully. To them, Ahmadi's generosity was complicated. He was their younger brother. He now signed their dividend checks. Public praise centered on him. Interviews requested his presence. Investors called him directly. His signature approved projects that bore their names, but not their authority. Over time, gratitude thinned. At family gatherings, subtle changes emerged. Conversations shifted when Ahmadi entered a room. Laughter paused. Decisions were deferred to him automatically, even in matters unrelated to business. The dynamic hardened into something unspoken but deeply felt. Ahmadi did not confront it. He believed provision was proof of love. At home, his life followed a different rhythm. He lived in a glass-fronted mansion positioned on elevated ground overlooking the city skyline. The structure blended steel, stone, and floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected sunrise and sunset in equal brilliance. Inside, the design was modern but warm. Polished marble floors softened by woven African rugs, sculptural lighting, and curated artwork from contemporary local artists. His wife, Zara, managed the interior with understated precision. At 28, Zara possessed striking elegance. Tall and slender with smooth caramel skin and expressive dark eyes framed by long lashes, she moved with composed grace.
Her wardrobe blended modern sophistication with subtle African heritage. Flowing gowns, silk head wraps on formal occasions, delicate gold jewelry that caught the light without overpowering it. She was educated, articulate, and actively involved in philanthropic foundations funded by Ahmadi's companies. Education programs for underserved communities, healthcare outreach initiatives, and women's entrepreneurship grants all bore her influence. She understood the public dimension of their lives, but she valued privacy above spectacle. Their son Jide was 4 years old, small for his age, with tightly coiled hair that curled softly around his forehead. Jide possessed bright, observant eyes. He carried his father's steady gaze and his mother's gentle smile. He moved through the house with quiet curiosity, often following Zara into meetings or watching Ahmadi from the staircase as he prepared for work. In the evenings, the family gathered in the open living room facing the glass walls. City lights flickered below as Jide played with wooden toy airplanes on the polished floor. Ahmadi would kneel beside him, guiding his small hands through imaginary takeoffs and landings. Zara often watched from the sofa, her expression steady and content. They were a family built on stability. The fracture began in private. The four brothers met without informing Ahmadi. The first conversations were framed as concerns about long-term control of the conglomerate. They discussed voting power. They analyzed share distribution. They questioned what would happen if Ahmadi expanded ownership beyond the family. Concern shifted to entitlement. Entitlement shifted to resentment. Resentment matured into conspiracy. They convinced themselves that the empire should have been collective from the beginning. They reinterpreted Ahmadi's leadership as dominance. They framed their dependency as humiliation. Over time, a narrative formed in which removing him appeared not as betrayal, but as correction. The plan required subtlety. Ahmadi owned a private jet registered under one of his aviation subsidiaries. It was maintained by certified engineers and flown by an experienced pilot who had served the family for years. Security protocols were strict, but familiarity often breeds complacency. The brothers leveraged access.
Through intermediaries and quiet financial incentives, they ensured that a critical component within the aircraft's system would fail mid-flight. The alteration was designed to appear mechanical, not intentional. Documentation would reflect routine maintenance. Suspicion would dissipate under the weight of technical ambiguity. The chosen day arrived without disruption. It was a scheduled family trip. Nothing unusual, no visible warning signs. Amadi reviewed documents in his study that morning before departure. Zara supervised packing with efficient calm. Jide moved between rooms holding a small backpack filled with toys he insisted on bringing. The drive to the private hangar followed familiar routes. Security personnel greeted them by name. The pilot conducted pre-flight checks. Weather conditions were clear. Inside the cabin, leather seats and polished surfaces reflected soft interior lighting. Zara fastened Jide's seatbelt herself. Amadi glanced at his watch as the engines powered up. The aircraft taxied smoothly. Takeoff was routine. For several minutes, nothing appeared out of place. The city receded beneath them. Clouds gathered at cruising altitude. Then the malfunction began. Warning signals flashed across the cockpit instruments. The pilot's voice tightened as he communicated system irregularities. Mechanical responses failed to align with command inputs. Hydraulic pressure dropped beyond recovery thresholds. Inside the cabin, the shift was immediate. The aircraft tilted unexpectedly. Overhead compartments rattled. Jide clutched his seat as Zara reached for him. Amadi unfastened his belt instinctively, moving toward them as turbulence intensified. The pilot attempted emergency procedures. Distress signals were transmitted. Nearby control towers registered fragmented communication before signal loss. The descent accelerated. Below them stretched an uninhabited expanse of dense jungle, far from major settlements or emergency response units. The aircraft clipped treetops before impact. The collision tore through the fuselage. Fire ignited upon contact with the forest floor. Metal fragmented. Fuel lines ruptured. The crash was violent and final. Amadi died at the scene. Zara died beside him. The pilot did not survive. The wreckage burned for hours, smoke rising above the canopy before dissipating into the afternoon sky. But Jide survived.
Flames consumed the remains of the aircraft, sending thick columns of smoke above the jungle canopy. Metal twisted inward under intense heat. Fragments of leather, wiring, and shattered glass lay scattered across scorched earth. The fire gradually weakened as fuel burned out, leaving behind smoldering debris and silence broken only by the crackle of dying embers. Several meters away from the main impact site, Jide stirred. He had been thrown clear during the collision, shielded in part by detached sections of the fuselage and dense vegetation that softened the force of impact. His small body bore cuts and bruises. His clothes were torn and darkened by soot. His ears rang with the fading echo of destruction. When he opened his eyes, the world felt unfamiliar. The sky above was partially blocked by thick branches. Smoke drifted in uneven patterns. The air smelled of fuel and burned metal. He pushed himself upright slowly, confusion clouding his expression. He called for his mother. He called for his father. There was no answer. The heat from the wreckage forced him to move away. He staggered through uneven ground, stepping over broken branches and disturbed soil. Tears mixed with ash on his cheeks. His small hands were stained black. The jungle around him was dense and humid. Towering trees formed a canopy that filtered sunlight into narrow beams. Vines wrapped around trunks in tight spirals. The undergrowth was thick thick with ferns and tangled roots. The air carried constant sound, distant bird calls, the steady hum of insects, occasional movement in unseen foliage. Jide continued walking without direction. His crying carried through the forest. It did not take long for something to respond. From between the trees, movement appeared, silent and coordinated. A pack of wolves emerged, lean, gray-coated, alert. Their bodies were low to the ground as they spread outward, forming a loose circle around the child. Their ears remained upright, their eyes fixed. They moved cautiously but deliberately, assessing. Jide stopped walking. He looked around and saw them closing in. Panic replaced confusion. He turned and ran, his small legs unsteady over uneven terrain. He stumbled over exposed roots and fell forward, striking the ground with force. Dirt pressed into his palms, his knees scraped against rough soil. The wolves advanced. Terrified, Jide rolled onto his back and covered his face with both hands. His breathing was uneven. He waited. Seconds passed. The growling, which had been low and constant, shifted. It did not intensify. It receded. Jide remained still. Then the sound changed again, no longer a predator's approach, but a cautious withdrawal. When he slowly uncovered his face, the wolves were stepping backward. Their backs lowered, their ears flattened, their bodies angled away in visible submission. Behind him stood a massive silverback gorilla. The animal's presence altered the clearing entirely. Its frame was enormous, muscles layered beneath thick, dark fur. A broad chest expanded with steady breaths. Across its back stretched a distinct silver saddle that marked dominance and maturity. Its arms hung long and powerful at its sides. Its eyes were steady, focused not on the child, but on the retreating wolves. The wolves did not challenge it. One by one, they disappeared between the trees. The clearing fell quiet. Jide turned slowly. He trembled, unsure whether he had escaped danger or entered a greater one. The gorilla stood motionless, observing him without visible aggression. "Are you going to eat me?" Jide asked in a small, unsteady voice. The gorilla did not bare its teeth. It did not charge. Instead, it shifted its weight, turned its broad back to him, and began walking away at a controlled pace. After several steps, it paused and looked back. The gesture was neither threatening nor inviting. It was deliberate. Jide hesitated. The forest behind him felt exposed. The direction the gorilla had come from felt contained, protected. He stood slowly and followed. The gorilla moved through the undergrowth with ease, parting foliage without effort. Jide struggled to keep pace, brushing aside leaves and stumbling over roots. The path was not straight. It curved and narrowed, weaving deeper into dense territory. After some distance, the sounds of other gorillas became audible. Low grunts, shifting branches, the rustle of movement above ground level. They entered a clearing that served as the troop's central space. Several gorillas were present, females with smaller frames, juveniles clinging to them, younger males positioned at the perimeter. All attention shifted to the silverback as it entered. The silverback stopped at the center. Jide remained a few steps behind. The troop assessed him in silence. The silverback emitted a low vocalization, steady and controlled. It was not aggressive. It was declarative. Gradually, tension in the clearing eased. The troop accepted the silverback's signal. That night, Jide did not understand what had occurred. He was too exhausted to process it fully. A female gorilla approached cautiously and pushed a cluster of leaves and fruit toward him. Hunger overcame hesitation. He ate. He slept curled near the outer edge of the troop, within the protective perimeter of the silverback. The jungle did not soften for him. The first weeks were survival. He learned to climb low branches to avoid ground-level threats. He learned which fruits were edible by observation. He followed the troop's movements closely, mimicking posture and pace. He watched how they communicated through gestures, posture shifts, and vocal patterns. He cried less as days passed. The memory of the crash remained fragmented, like flashes of light and noise disconnected from sequence. Names formed in his mind, his mother's voice, his father's face, but repetition without response gradually reduced the urgency of calling for them. The jungle imposed structure. Rainfall came without warning, drenching everything within minutes. Dry seasons brought harsher sunlight and longer searches for water. The troop migrated within its territory in response to food availability. Predators were avoided through awareness and coordinated movement. The silverback maintained constant vigilance. Whenever distant growls or unfamiliar scents approached, it positioned itself between threat and troop. On multiple occasions, its mere presence redirected danger before conflict escalated. Jide learned the boundaries of the territory through repetition. He also learned trust. The younger gorillas began interacting with him cautiously. They touched his hands. They tugged at his clothes. They observed his movements. In time, they treated him as one of their own. Months turned into years. His body adapted to the environment. The softness of early childhood disappeared. His limbs grew lean and defined from climbing and running. His shoulders broadened. His reflexes sharpened. His once soft hands became calloused and strong. His feet toughened from constant contact with uneven ground. His skin darkened under continuous sun exposure. His movements changed. He walked upright, but often leaned forward instinctively while navigating slopes. He could scale low trees with efficiency. He could remain silent for extended periods, alert to distant sounds. Language faded in frequency, though not entirely in memory. Words no longer structured his days. Observation did. The silverback remained central in his world. It corrected him when he strayed too far. It blocked his path when danger approached. It shared space during rest periods. When disputes arose within the troop, the silverback resolved them through controlled dominance rather than uncontrolled aggression. Jide watched and learned hierarchy, protection, and restraint. Seasons repeated. The jungle marked time through cycles rather than calendars. Flowering periods signaled abundance. Drought signaled caution. The growth of younger gorillas marked the passage of years. Jide grew alongside them. Scars accumulated on his arms and legs from falls and minor conflicts. His hair grew longer and wilder, shaped by humidity and neglect. His facial features matured, slowly revealing the strong jawline he had inherited from his father. The wreckage side of the aircraft was eventually reclaimed by vegetation. Metal sank into soil. Ash dispersed. Nature absorbed the evidence. Human search efforts never penetrated deeply enough to reach the troop's territory. The jungle's density shielded its inhabitants from detection. 10 years passed. At 14, Jide stood taller and stronger, his posture confident within the forest's structure. He moved with familiarity across terrain that would disorient most adults. He recognized bird calls that signaled warning. He understood which streams remained reliable during dry periods. The silverback had aged but remained dominant.
Within the troupe, Jide held a distinct position, neither fully animal nor fully removed from what he had once been. He retained an awareness in his eyes that did not belong entirely to the wild. Yet the jungle had become his world. The crash that had severed him from his past had also placed him within a new order governed by instinct, strength, and territory. For 10 years, the forest was not a prison. It was home. A decade after the crash, the Okeke name remained dominant in the business pages. In the immediate aftermath of the tragedy, the four brothers had presented a unified public front. They stood before cameras dressed in black, faces solemn, voices steady as they described the loss of their younger brother, his wife, and their son. They funded memorial services attended by government officials and industry leaders. Statements were issued describing Amadi as visionary, disciplined, irreplaceable. Behind that display, controls shifted swiftly.
Board meetings were convened within weeks of the crash. Emergency succession protocols were activated. As legal stakeholders already embedded within the conglomerate, the brothers positioned themselves as collective stewards of Amadi's empire. Voting structures were rebalanced. Key executive roles were reassigned. Advisors who had once reported directly to Amadi now answered to a rotating leadership council headed primarily by Chuka. The transition appeared orderly. Share prices stabilized after a brief period of uncertainty. Investors were assured that continuity would be maintained. Projects initiated under Amadi's leadership moved forward, though often with altered timelines and internal oversight. Publicly, the brothers prospered. Chuka assumed the role of acting chairman. He expanded his physical presence, favoring darker suits and heavier fabrics that reinforced authority. His voice during press briefings was controlled and deliberate. He emphasized stability and long-term strategy. Emeka focused on public relations and international partnerships. His charm remained useful. He hosted investors, attended economic summits, and appeared on panels discussing infrastructure development and market expansion. Ike oversaw security and logistics divisions. He maintained a rigid management style and demanded loyalty within his operational units. His temper, though moderated for corporate settings, remained close to the surface. Kelechi managed legal affairs and compliance. He positioned himself as the calm mediator in board discussions, his language measured and precise. Together, they maintained the structure Amadi had built. Within the mansion that once housed Amadi, Zara, and Jide, little changed outwardly. The property was preserved, maintained by staff who had served the family for years. Among them was Obialor. At 50, Obialor remained tall and wiry, his posture straight despite the passing years. Gray had begun to gather at his temples, but his movements were disciplined and efficient. He dressed simply: pressed shirts, dark trousers, polished shoes. He had served the Okeke family for more than 2 decades, beginning when the brothers were still young men navigating uncertain futures. His loyalty was not a performance. It had been earned through years of shared history, small kindnesses, and mutual respect. On the day of the crash, Obialor had remained inside the mansion as the brothers gathered in the main sitting room to discuss immediate implications. He moved quietly between rooms, performing his duties without drawing attention. From behind a partially closed door, he overheard fragments of conversation. The tone was not mournful. It was analytical. They discussed share redistribution. They debated control of aviation assets. They spoke of consolidating authority before external parties attempted influence. There was mention of timing, of opportunity, of ensuring that no competing claims emerged. The language was too precise for men newly grieving.
Obialor listened without revealing his presence. Suspicion formed, but suspicion alone carried no legal weight. There was no evidence, no recorded admission, no document linking them to sabotage. The crash had been attributed to mechanical failure after preliminary investigation. Aviation authorities closed the case without identifying foul play. Obialor remained silent. Years passed, and silence hardened into vigilance. He observed how quickly the brothers removed certain long-standing advisors from influence. He noted how internal audit trails were reorganized. He saw how assets tied specifically to Ahmadi's personal trusts were absorbed into broader corporate structures. He kept his observations to himself. 10 years after the crash, a televised news report interrupted the regular flow of corporate headlines. The segment featured footage captured by a regional wildlife team operating near a remote forest zone. The footage showed a teenage boy moving through dense terrain with unusual agility. Authorities described him as having survived in isolation for nearly a decade. His appearance suggested long-term exposure to the wild. His speech, according to officials, was limited but functional. The report requested public assistance in identifying the boy and locating any surviving family members. Obialor was alone in the mansion staff quarters when the broadcast aired. He stood still as the camera zoomed in on the boy's face. Though older and leaner, the resemblance was unmistakable. The jawline mirrored Ahmadi's. The eyes carried Zara's depth. The posture, even within the forest setting, reflected something disciplined and observant. It was Jide. Obialor felt recognition immediately, without hesitation. He replayed the footage several times through online news archives. Each viewing confirmed what he already knew. The child presumed dead had survived. The implications were immediate.
Under existing inheritance laws, Jide was the direct legal heir to Ahmadi's controlling interests. The structure the brothers had built over the past decade relied on the absence of that heir. Obialor understood that the news report would not go unnoticed. Within hours, the same footage circulated through financial networks and social media platforms. Analysts speculated privately about potential inheritance complications. Corporate advisors began quiet reviews of succession documents. One of the brothers saw the report that evening. Emeka encountered the footage first during a routine scan of media coverage. He paused when the boy's image filled the screen. Recognition arrived not gradually, but instantly. He contacted Chuka. Within the hour, all four brothers had convened in a private office at corporate headquarters. The meeting was closed door. No assistants were present. No recording devices were permitted inside. The initial reaction was disbelief, followed quickly by calculation. If the boy was indeed Jide, he represented a direct threat to their authority. At 17, he would possess the legal capacity to assert control over assets tied specifically to his father's name. Even before that age, public knowledge of his survival could destabilize investor confidence and trigger legal scrutiny. Chuka spoke first, voice controlled but firm. They would verify the identity independently before any public acknowledgement. They would manage information flow. They would prevent the situation from escalating beyond their control. Ike's response was less measured. He viewed the development as unfinished business. Kelechi emphasized caution. Any overt action would attract attention. The circumstances surrounding the crash, though officially closed, could be reopened under renewed investigation if suspicion gained traction. Emeka focused on timing. The boy's location was now known broadly enough that government agencies and humanitarian organizations would likely initiate retrieval efforts.
The conclusion reached was unspoken but shared. They would correct their previous mistake. Surveillance contacts were activated. Discreet inquiries were made to determine the exact coordinates of the forest region referenced in the report. Funds were allocated for private contractors capable of operating outside formal channels. Back at the mansion, Obialor acted without waiting for confirmation of the brothers' response. He accessed archived legal documents detailing the original structure of Ahmadi's holdings. He reviewed clauses related to minor heirs and custodial guardianship. He gathered copies of birth certificates, trust registrations, and shareholder agreements that clearly named Jide as successor. He understood the risk. If the brothers moved first, the outcome would mirror the past. Obialor arranged transportation quietly, avoiding corporate vehicles traceable to the Okeke conglomerate. He withdrew personal savings accumulated over decades of service. He contacted an old acquaintance familiar with remote terrain logistics, requesting guidance toward the forest region referenced in the report. He did not inform the mansion staff of his departure, beyond stating that he required temporary leave. Before leaving the estate, he walked through the empty rooms once occupied by Ahmadi's family. The glass walls still reflected the city skyline. The living room remained arranged as it had been years earlier. A small shelf in an upstairs bedroom still contained children's books and a model airplane, preserved but untouched. Obialor paused briefly at the doorway. He did not allow emotion to override urgency. Meanwhile, within corporate headquarters, the brothers advanced their preparations. Discreet communications were exchanged with individuals accustomed to operating without official oversight. Travel routes were mapped. Equipment was assembled. Publicly, they maintained composure. No statement was issued regarding the news report. Internally, contingency plans were drafted for asset protection in the event that the boy's identity was confirmed publicly. Recognition had come immediately. If Jide was alive, he was the legal heir, and the structure they had constructed over 10 years rested on his absence. The forest that had shielded him for a decade was no longer a distant wilderness. It had become the center of a renewed struggle over power, inheritance, and unfinished intent. Both sides were moving. Neither intended to yield. Obialor did not wait for official confirmation from authorities or for public debate to unfold. He understood the urgency with clarity. If he had recognized Jide from the news footage, the brothers would have done the same. Any delay increased the likelihood that they would reach the forest first. He traveled with limited resources and quiet urgency. The journey required multiple stages. Commercial transport carried him as far as paved infrastructure allowed.
From there, he hired local guides familiar with the terrain bordering the forest region referenced in the broadcast. He avoided using his full name. He paid in cash where possible. He asked few questions and offered fewer answers. As the road narrowed into dirt pathways and then into foot trails, Obialor dismissed his final guide and continued alone. He carried a small pack containing water, dried food, basic medical supplies, and copies of key legal documents sealed in waterproof casing. His clothing shifted from city formality to durable field wear. Dark trousers, sturdy boots, a long-sleeved shirt suited to dense vegetation. The forest thickened quickly. Humidity pressed against his skin. Insects gathered around exposed areas. The ground shifted unpredictably underfoot. Obialor moved carefully but steadily, guided by descriptions he had memorized from the report and by subtle signs of repeated animal movement. He did not know precisely how he would locate Jide. He trusted that proximity and persistence would narrow the distance. The first sign that he had entered protected territory came without warning. Branches snapped in coordinated rhythm behind him. He turned slowly. Several silverbacks emerged from between the trees, each larger than any gorilla he had previously seen. Their shoulders were broad and muscular, their silver saddles distinct beneath filtered light. They moved without haste, but with unmistakable dominance. Obialor raised his hands instinctively. He did not attempt to run. One of the gorillas advanced and struck the ground near his feet. The impact sent vibrations through the soil. Another moved behind him, blocking retreat. Within seconds, he was encircled. A powerful arm knocked him off balance. He fell forward, the air forced from his lungs as his chest struck the earth. Heavy weight pressed against his back, holding him down. The scent of damp fur and vegetation filled his senses. He remained still. He understood that resistance would escalate the situation beyond control. The pressure increased as one gorilla leaned closer, its breath audible near his ear. Another emitted a low warning sound, a deep vibration that communicated territorial authority. Before any strike occurred, a voice cut through the tension. "Uncle Obialor." The tone was deeper than memory, but unmistakable. The gorillas paused. The weight against Obialor's back lifted slightly. He raised his head. Standing several meters away was Jide. At 14, he was tall for his age. His body was lean and defined from constant physical exertion. Muscles along his arms and legs were pronounced but not exaggerated. His hair had grown longer, thick and untamed, framing a face sharpened by adolescence. His skin carried the mark of prolonged sun exposure. His posture was balanced and alert. His eyes, however, remained unchanged. They carried the same steady depth as Ahmadi's. Recognition moved across both faces at once. Obialor rose slowly to his knees as the gorillas stepped back, responding not to him, but to Jide's presence. The silverback positioned at the center of the clearing observed closely, but did not advance. "Jide," Obialor said quietly. The name bridged 10 years of absence. They closed the distance between them and embraced. The contact was brief but firm, a confirmation of survival. Up close, Obialor saw how completely the jungle had shaped the boy. His movements were economical, his breathing steady. He carried himself with awareness of surroundings at all times. They stepped aside from the troop, though never entirely beyond its perimeter. Obialor spoke without delay. He described the crash not as accident, but as sabotage. He explained what he had overheard the day of the tragedy, discussions of asset division before official confirmation of death. He outlined the legal structure that named Jide as sole heir to Ahmadi's controlling interests. He spoke of the televised report and the likely reaction of the brothers. He did not embellish. He stated facts. "The forest is no longer safe," he concluded. "They will come armed. They will remove any obstacle between themselves and control." Jide listened in silence. His expression did not shift dramatically. Years in the jungle had trained him to process information without visible reaction. Yet the weight of what he heard was evident in the tightening of his jaw. His loyalty to the guerrilla troop was not symbolic. They had protected him when he was defenseless. The silverback had positioned itself between him and danger countless times. The troop had shared food and territory without rejecting him. Leaving them would not be a simple departure. Obialor understood the conflict without needing it spoken aloud. "You can return," he said quietly. "But first, you must survive." The silverback remained at a distance, observing the exchange. It neither approached nor withdrew. Before Jide could respond, a sharp crack split the air. The sound was unnatural within the forest's rhythm. Gunfire. Birds erupted from treetops in chaotic motion. Leaves trembled as movement advanced from multiple directions. Jide turned immediately toward the sound. Obialor's expression hardened. Another shot followed, closer this time. From between the trees, 5 armed men emerged in coordinated formation. They wore neutral clothing suited to rough terrain. Rifles were raised and steady. Their faces were partially concealed. They surrounded the clearing efficiently. Seconds later, 4 additional figures stepped forward from behind the gunman. Chuka led them, his posture controlled despite the uneven ground. Age had broadened his frame further, but his gaze remained sharp. Emeka stood to his right, composed but alert. Ike's expression was unmasked hostility. Kelechi maintained a restrained exterior, though tension was visible in his shoulders. They had arrived prepared. Chuka surveyed the scene. Jide, Obialor, the guerrillas positioned beyond immediate firing range. "So it is true," he said, his voice carrying across the clearing. Emeka studied Jide closely. "You survived." Ike's hand tightened around his weapon. Kelechi spoke next. "This does not need to be complicated." Their words were direct. They framed their actions as necessity. They referenced stability, corporate continuity, protection of what they had built over 10 years. They did not deny prior sabotage. They did not admit it formally either. Their focus remained on eliminating a threat. Obialor stepped slightly in front of Jide. The gesture was instinctive. One of the gunmen forced him down with the barrel of a rifle. Jide was pushed to his knees beside him. The soil pressed into his palms. The silverback emitted a low resonant sound from the perimeter. The troop shifted but did not yet advance. Chuka gave a small nod. The order to fire approached. Then the forest responded. From multiple angles, the guerrilla troop charged. The silverback led. Massive bodies collided with armed men before they could adjust aim effectively. One rifle discharged into the canopy. Another fell from its holder's grip as a guerrilla struck from the side. Chaos replaced formation. Gunshots rang out in rapid succession. Some struck trees, others hit the ground. The sound of metal clashing against bone and wood echoed across the clearing. Ike attempted to regain control, shouting commands drowned out by the noise. Emeka stumbled backward as a juvenile gorilla leapt past him. Kelechi retreated toward denser brush, attempting to reposition. The silverback engaged directly with one of the gunmen, knocking him off balance with overwhelming force. Another gorilla seized a weapon and flung it aside. Screams mixed with animal roars. In the confusion, Obialor seized the moment. He pulled Jide upright. "Now," he said. They ran. Jide moved with instinctive familiarity through the terrain. Obialor followed, breath measured but urgent. Gunfire continued behind them, sporadic and disorganized. Branches snapped as both men and animals shifted positions. They did not look back. The forest thickened as they moved deeper before curving toward its outer edges. Jide chose paths that minimized exposure, navigating slopes and narrow clearings known only through years of repetition. They traveled until gunfire faded entirely. Night fell before they stopped. Obialor assessed minor injuries, scratches, superficial cuts, but neither had sustained serious harm.
They rested briefly before continuing at dawn. The journey out of the forest required days. They avoided main roads. They moved through smaller settlements cautiously. Obialor used remaining funds to secure transportation under assumed names. He avoided electronic transactions linked to the Okeke network. Eventually, they reached a distant city far removed from the immediate influence of the Okeke conglomerate. There, within a modest apartment secured under private arrangement, Jide remained indoors while Obialor established limited trusted contacts. Legal documents were secured. Identity verification would require timing and discretion. At 17, Jide would possess full legal authority to assert his claim. Until then, concealment was protection. The brothers had not been neutralized. They retained wealth, influence, and reach. Their attempt in the forest had failed, but their motive remained unchanged. In the quiet of the unfamiliar city, Jide adjusted gradually to structured shelter once more. The jungle had shaped his body and instincts. The city would now demand patience and restraint. The conflict was no longer hidden within trees. It had shifted into waiting. Jealousy had initiated the first act. Power would define the next.
Comment Part 2 if you want to know what happened next to Jide and Obialor. Like, comment, share, subscribe, and turn on the notification button.